Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lesson in cultural anthropology. I'm Eric Olson, professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College. And today we're going to be talking about when is it ethnicity? So, when I raise that question, really what I'm talking about is something that we talk about in anthropology all the time, the difference between individual and population level cultural phenomena. And ethnicity is one of those tricky ones where we self-identify with an ethnic identity in many cases, but ethnicity itself is an imagined community, right? So we imagine ourselves sharing some sort of bond, whether that's historically, linguistically, with foodways, lifeways, religion, politics, etc. So it's something we individually identify with, but it's something that we have to collectively imagine with a larger population. So in order to understand that, we're going to work our way from individual identity and work our way up to the population and understand how it's mobilized and contested and how these ideologies of imagined communities are reproduced for good and for bad, so to speak. So when we talk about the individual, I'm going to use myself as an example. So, being raised in Northeast Ohio, I have a particular way of calling this particular area between the sidewalk and the road. Now, if you're from the Akron area, and only the Akron area, you will have a specific word for this. And you can see this in the title of the file that I saved this under. We call this the Devil Strip. And if you're not from, the Akron area, then you're not going to call that the Devil Strip. And since I was born and raised in the Akron area, I call it the Devil Strip. It just makes sense in my mind. So that's something linguistically that I was taught and raised to understand. But, people from Cleveland might call that the tree lawn or not have a word for it at all. There might not be any linguistic term for the area between the sidewalk and the road, but I call it the Devil Strip. Don't ask me why it's called the Devil Strip. I've heard many a weird nebulous legend and urban myth about it. But then, also keeping in mind that ethnicity can be both individual and population based, I'm also from Northeast Ohio, and yet when I hold this can of beverage in my hand, I do not call this pop, which is what other people from Northeast Ohio would call this. I would call this soda, and that just sounds right to me, even though I was raised in Northeast Ohio, so enculturated and surrounded by people who called that pop. So that's just one example of how ethnicity is both individual and at the population level. And so that's where anthropologists kind of get into this tricky question of when is it ethnicity? Learning to call this pop comes from my parents not being from Northeast Ohio, my mother being raised in Western Pennsylvania, my father being raised in Lake Superior region, Duluth, Superior, Wisconsin. And so they were not raised on the idea of calling this pop. They called it soda. And so I learned that from my parents, and thus that's why I call it soda and not pop, even though I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio. And other things like the Devil Strip I pick up along the way. So kind of merging multiple different cultures as an individual. But if we kind of move on from there, we can start to understand ethnicity as something that's beyond kinship, right? So the examples I've given you are sort of a mix of what I learned from my parents. So they called it soda, so I call it soda. But they didn't have a term really for the area on your lawn. And so I picked that up from, going to school and meeting other people from Northeast Ohio and the Akron area, calling that the Devil Strip. So that's an example of individual expressions of ethnicity, and these are not exactly the best examples of it. But if we move to beyond kinship, we might start to talk about things like music. And so for that, I'm going to don my headphones, and we're going to look at least one example of music. So something that's unique to Northeast Ohio, and obviously I'm focusing on Northeast Ohio because Tri-C, we're based out of Northeast Ohio in the Cleveland area. So I'm focusing on things that we might be able to quickly identify in our region. So if you tune into Z88 or WZIP 88.1 on a Sunday morning, you're going to hear polka music similar to this. I get dizzy. All right, we're going to pause that there. So that was a song by Frankie Yankovic. It's a polka song from the mid-20th century. And in Northeast Ohio and really the Midwest in general, you have this use of polka music as sort of an ethnic identity, especially in the mid-20th century and early 20th century, late 19th century. This was common amongst immigrant families where you have a lot of Polish, other Eastern European, I should say, Czech, Slovakian, playing polka music as a way to identify and unify their sort of communities, immigrant communities. They may be from diverse backgrounds within Slovakia or within the Czech Republic or within Poland, which they may not have even been from these places if they were considered countries at the time they were immigrating. But they are able to unify by listening to common music, being able to dance together, easy ways of social cohesion. So polka music, pretty pervasive in the Midwest, but not universal in the United States as a sort of cultural identifier. But certainly something in Northeast Ohio that's sort of evolved over the decades, and that at one point it used to be a means of cultural preservation or a way of continuing cultural traditions. But now we see it more as a sort of thing that's just general to Northeast Ohio. Like, I have no direct connection to Poland or the Czech Republic. I have no ancestry, even if I go back 500 years to, where people came over to, North America from like England and Wales and whatnot. But I very much identify polka music as part of my heritage and my ethnic upbringing because I live in Northeast Ohio and because my grandfather listened to polka music and really enjoyed it. So it's become part of this sort of Northeast Ohio ethnic identity, even if you don't have necessarily blood lineage to, people who brought that music over, hundreds of years ago in the past. So that's just another example of social cohesion beyond kinship, of reinforcing these sorts of perceptions of what ethnicity is. So when is it ethnicity, right? Is, calling this soda versus pop, is that a form of ethnic identity, or is that just an idiosyncratic thing to me? And so that's something as anthropologists we have to ask ourselves: when is it ethnicity? And we could really ask this question, this scalar question, of a lot of different cultural phenomena. But today we're focusing on ethnicity. And really, when we start to get way beyond kinship levels, we can start looking at non-kinship based forms of ethnicity. I mean, technically, that makes no sense. Can you tell I only have a loose script for this? But when we start talking about things like countries or regions within the United States, we can start to see that ethnicity plays a much more important role in social cohesion beyond kinship levels. So this is a map of world populations, at least estimated from 2018. And I'll put this in the description below. But just take a look at the way these countries are represented. Each block represents 500,000 people. So Canada, if we were to condense it and visually represent it by its population, is actually quite small compared to the United States. China and India, unsurprisingly, are very large based on their populations. Nigeria, very large. Brazil. And a lot of these South American countries are actually quite small. Uruguay only has about 3.5 million people. Colombia, about 50 million. Mexico, 130 million. So when we start to get to these large sort of nation states, or as we would probably call more aptly just the state, using state in the capital S and putting the in front of it, we're starting to talk about things that are a bit beyond what ethnicity has traditionally been typified as or viewed in the sort of prehistoric to early historic sense of it, when sort of the nation state and ethnic identity were pretty compatible and pretty much overlapped. But what we've seen in the last 100 years is that that's not necessarily the case. So now you have this conflict of ethnic identity not really meshing well with national identity. And in a few cases, to be clear, ethnicity can be mobilized as sort of that social cohesion, especially in opposition to national identity or in opposition to oppression or marginalization. So some great examples of that are an ethnography about Chinatown. So Chinatowns in the United States are sort of this idea of social cohesion. China, obviously, being a country of over 1 billion people today, and one of the most densely populated countries in the world. This book from 1982, sorry for the reflection there, Chinatown and Economic Adaptation and Ethnic Identity of the Chinese. This one focuses on Manhattan's Chinatown and really the history of Chinatowns as sort of ethnic enclaves, despite the fact that people came from all walks of life, and China being a very diverse country. Just as I was describing, polka music does not typify all of American cultures. Chinese ethnic enclaves in, say, Manhattan, San Diego, El Paso. That's one I learned about from this book. are sort of this way of unionizing. Think of it as sort of a way of creating social cohesion where there is culture shock, where you are immediately put in a marginalized or minority position, where Chinese culture is the minority culture. And so it behooves other people of similar descent or similar cultural backgrounds to unify under this moniker of Chinese identity. Even if they were to go back to China, they would realize that there is a high degree of diversity within China. Another example of that is the Shawnees and the War for America. The Shawnee and the Pan-Indian movement of the late 18th and early 19th century, think Tecumseh, sort of creating a unified Pan-Indian or universal American Indian perspective in opposition to colonial conquest and expansion by the United States, by Great Britain, and by other colonial powers in native North America. And if you want to learn more about these two particular books, I recommend you go listen to the podcast from the archives. You can go check out those videos. They're also on the YouTube channel, or you can go listen to them on any place where you get the podcast. That's the actual edited version. The raw, unedited versions are on the YouTube channel, so you can actually see what the books look like. But those are two examples of mobilization of ethnic identity, sort of as a positive, sort of like unionization. Think of them like a labor union, or I guess I use that one a lot, but labor union I think is a simple enough metaphor to compare the two. But remember, the modern global world is very different than it was in the early 1800s, or even in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Both world wars have drastically altered the borders around the world. Africa did not look the way it does today, even 50 or 60 years ago. Some of these countries did not have independence from colonial powers until less than 50 years ago. Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980. So for perspective, most of the countries that we see today did not exist 100 years ago. And so when you have this tension of ethnic identities not meshing well with political boundaries, you can have ethnic conflicts, genocide, war. A lot of bad things can happen. And so it's in the interest of the nation, or the state as we would call it, to sort of solidify nationalism, create some sort of unification around a national identity. And one of the best ways to mobilize that ideology is through sport. And the Olympics is a great political stage for mobilizing nationalism and promoting sort of this perception of what it means to be from country X, Y, or Z. And so a couple of examples that I want to draw on at this sort of most extreme level, going from the individual all the way up to the nation state, or the international stage, we could say, is taking an example from Turkmenistan. So this is a music video produced in Turkmenistan, in Turkmen, and it is by Myari. I don't speak Turkmen, but using sort of like how we talked about polka music earlier, and how it was mobilized as a way of sort of ethnic identity in Northeast Ohio, but in the Midwest in general, and how it's sort of something that we in the Midwest listen to, even if it's not necessarily something we identify as being directly related to our lineage or our ancestry. So states mobilize the same things for nationalism and national ideology. So in this case, it's kind of beating you over the head, but I thought it was a good example. She does do other music, and this came from an assignment I used to do 2 years ago, where I had students find songs from countries that they picked. Like, there was a list of 30 countries that I would make them pick, all non-Western, and then they would do research on those countries to get a non-Western perspective on things. And so you can go listen to that. That playlist is available. That's from a class like 3 or 4 years ago at least. But this example comes from that assignment, looking at how music can be a tool of ideological reproduction by the state. So we can see in the background there, we got that big, grandiose engineering structure, the water, beautiful sunset, and then just wait until, they're bringing the kids. Everybody loves kids. And then if we look at what the actual lyrics are saying, if I can pull them up here, I obviously do not speak Turkmen, but the lyrics are introduces the wide world. The Turkmen are great, sustainable. The universe will observe you. Every generation will praise you. Everyone is proud of you today. Forward, only forward. The Turkmen nation is coming, world. Listen to us. Know the Turkmen nation. So, in a lot of cases, it's not so over the head propaganda. I guess I don't need my headphones anymore. But that's just one example of how sort of ethnic identity can be grafted. Grafted is probably not the best word, but these ideologies can be mobilized by the state to promote nationalism, to promote sort of ethnic identity that's syncretic with the state. And obviously, it's in the state's interest. They don't want, infighting. They don't want civil war. Don't want to have conflict within their borders, ideally. And so, obviously, it behooves the state. And I'm talking about the state as if it's this sort of sentient being that makes its own decisions and not this nebulous concept that exists beyond the individual level. And, how does an ideology make its own decisions? That's something we'll get into when we talk about politics and power. That's a whole other ball game right there. But it's also something that, where's my other example? I had it pulled up here, that you can mobilize through sport. And, sport being, you get national anthems as a way of mobilizing ideologies around kind of merging ethnicity and nationalism. And sport is basically the perfect stage for political ideology about nationalism, which is sort of being, grafted by ethnic identity. And so what I did was, now, let me preface by saying, I very much enjoy the Olympics. I love watching them. My wife and I look forward to watching the opening and closing ceremonies and all that kind of stuff. But as anthropologists, we have to be cogently aware that the Olympics is basically, internationally sponsored political theater. You have the Parade of Nations. You get to wave your flag. You get to promote your country. You get to say, "Oh, my country won this many gold medals. We're better than you. Ha ha." But not only that, you have controversies and conflicts and scandals that center around the Olympics. And what I did was, Wikipedia has an entire page. That's how many there are. They just created its own wiki page on the controversies and scandals at Olympic Games, both Summer and Winter Olympics. And so what I've done is I've just highlighted a few here to illustrate my point of the Olympics are basically the world stage for nationalism theater and promoting nationalism ideology. Again, I do enjoy the Olympics, but we cannot deny that the Olympic Committee's mission statement does not actually mesh up well with reality. Their mission statement being it's about athletes and competition amongst athletes and unity, and not about nations and countries bettering themselves on a world stage. But if we look at the actual reality of it, what's happened since 1896, what I've highlighted in black here, these little black diamonds represent instances where the Olympic Committee has banned members from participating. So you would think after the World War, a great way of unifying people coming together in competition where we don't shoot each other is, settling things on the track and field. But instead, the Olympic Committee decided, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Turkey were not allowed to participate in the 1920 or the 1924 Olympics. The same thing happened in 1948. The Axis powers were banned from the Olympics in 1948, not allowed to participate. In 1964, South Africa was banned due to apartheid. And then if we look at the ones that I've circled red here, these are instances where more than one country boycotted the Olympics, and oftentimes this was boycotting in sort of collective groups. So the 1936 Olympics, several countries boycotted because of Nazi Germany. So obviously not necessarily obviously the Nazis are easy bad guys in that case, so maybe not the best example. But I am just pointing out here when things are boycotted. 1976, we've got multiple boycotts, 1980, 1984, 2014. And then, of course, the big elephant that I haven't even talked about yet is highlighting instances where people were killed during politicized events at the Olympics, either due to conflicts arising from hosting the Olympics or accidents that occurred on the course. So the one example being 2010, the luger who was killed in practice, and basically the investigation finding initially that it was the luger's fault and not the people who designed the course or made it, the host country who literally built the entire track and for the luge, couldn't possibly be them at fault. Or we could talk about the Atlanta bombing, in which one person was killed, 11 were injured. The whole point of that bombing was an anti-communist statement, I believe. The point being they were using the Olympics as a political stage to make a political statement by bombing someone, so it was a terrorist attack. The Munich massacre, where there's a Palestinian-Israeli hostage conflict, in which all the Israeli and Palestinians were killed, Palestinians killing the Israelis, and then the police were getting involved. Some police died as well. There's a whole movie about it, Munich. And then the worst one was the 1968 Mexico City Olympics, where there was college demonstrations against race and racism, and the police were called in to deal with riots, or what they called riots, and then upwards of 350 to 400 people were killed and over 1,000 were injured days before the opening ceremony of the Olympics. And so they were holding these protests in preparation for the world stage. All eyes are on Mexico City. This is the opportunity to raise concerns about these issues. And so, just as an example, even though the best intentions are to be about, world unity and, settling things on the field amongst athletes and athletic competition, it's very much sport. And we can look at this historically. There's an entire book. Unfortunately, I don't have it in my library here. It's up in my Tri-C library. We could talk about how Native North American games were oftentimes used as a means of dispute settlement and conflict resolution in situations where it wasn't quite foreign attackers, but they weren't quite kinship. So they kind of fit in between. They basically were ethnic differences that they settled via sport and not necessarily via warfare. And so that's just another example as well. So you can see it can get complicated really fast when we talk about ethnicity, and why I decided to title this lesson, When is it ethnicity? At what point is it no longer something that's unique to the individual? Whether I call this soda versus pop, whether I call this the devil strip, when is it considered something that is ethnicity, an imagined community, and is it something that I identify with as an individual? And this is a tricky thing that we as anthropologists are constantly grappling with. But I just wanted to take a few examples today to talk about ethnicity and how you can start to dissect it in your everyday life and observe it in other people's life, how it's performed, how it's negotiated, how it's contested. So, I might choose to say pop sometimes. I have been known from time to time to say pop because it's just situationally appropriate and it's minimally invasive into everyday life. It's not going to cause a stir. So ethnicity can be performed and negotiated in other cases. When I am traveling abroad, I usually don't say I'm from Ohio. I sometimes say I'm from Ohio, but most people from outside the United States don't really know much beyond New York, LA, Disneyland. I know that is a very overarching statement, but when I was in Japan and I was in Osaka, a rural suburb of Osaka, Sakai City, the guy asked me, "Oh, you're from America, where from?" I said, "Ohio." His response was, "Is that close to Disney World?" So sometimes you have to mobilize your ethnicity and change your ethnic identity in context-specific situations. When I'm in an airport in Greece with a bunch of Americans from all different walks of life around the United States, we all identify as American in that airport because we are in a foreign country and we are in a different culture. And so it makes sense for us to sort of social cohesion, unify in that sense under a similar ethnic identity. So ethnic identity is not this fixed unit that's never changing. It's something that's always mobilized and contested in different contexts. So that's going to do it for today's lesson. Hopefully you got some interesting insight. Go check out, if you're in the Midwest and you have a radio station that plays polka music, check it out on a Sunday morning sometime. That's usually when polka is played, Sunday or Saturday mornings. Or go check out, what your community is known for or your region is known for. Try and think about how, these different scales of ethnicity, maybe explore some stuff on your own. Go listen to Miari. She's got some other good pop music as well. But that's going to do it for today's lesson. And I will see you in the next lesson or next video, whatever that might be. And until then, never stop learning.